Are you serious? Yeah. Kira. She helps with the knowledge. That's actually because they wanted a date, but then they stopped talking. That's why you're in time.
All right. So you picked up a bunch of things on the way in. We're going to start with the note packet for Unit 10. That's going to be your last printed note packet that you get from me for the year. We will get to the pipe cleaners in a minute, and the other handout you will get a little bit later. And people at home, you'll be doing a virtual activity or version of the activity that we're going to do later. Today we're starting with a little review of the language that we use when we talk about how organisms are classified. This is really closely connected to evolution because as organisms kind of branched off from each other in those lovely trees of life that you drew earlier this week, they kind of break themselves into smaller and smaller groups depending on the traits that they have. So I wanted to just review this vocab so that when you hear it, you have an idea of what we're talking about. It's not something we're going to spend a ton of time on. But out of these words, which one is the largest classification? There is actually one larger than kingdom. Kingdom used to be the biggest. Domain is actually the biggest. Yep. So domain is actually the largest. There are 3 domains of living things. You don't need to write these down, but eukarya, so everything with eukaryotic cells is all in the same domain. And then there's bacteria and archaea, which are those like extremophile bacteria that live in really crazy places like the bottom of the ocean and thermal hot springs and things. So there's 3 domains. And then the domains are broken into what next? Kingdoms. Yep, kingdom is the next one. Then what?
Classes.
Not quite.
Yes.
King Phillips, I forget this sentence. Anybody know the mnemonic for this?
No.
Which one's the smallest? You probably know that. Species is actually the smallest. So here you go. There's some mnemonic about King Philip, but I don't know it because I don't usually teach this that way. So, domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. The ones that you hear about the most frequently are the largest and the smallest. We talk a lot about domains, kingdoms, and phyla, which is the plural of phylum, when we classify and organize living things. But you also hear a lot about genus and species, because whenever you see the scientific name of an organism, you're looking at its genus and species. So, for example, the scientific name of human beings, Homo sapiens. Homo is the genus to which human beings belong. There are a few other species. I don't know if there are any living members of the genus Homo, but like Neanderthals and some of the primitive forms of human beings were also in the same genus, but they were not the same species. Homo sapiens, that is our species name. And the way that you write a scientific name, the genus is always capitalized, the species is lowercase. And the whole thing should either be underlined or italicized if you're typing. Yeah? Do you have a question? No. Okay. The important thing, the reason that I'm kind of pointing this out is just that you will see, and I've probably already seen a lot of scientific names in scenarios and questions and problems through this class. And you will see more when you see some big, long, Latin-y sounding thing in italics. You don't need to know what that means. You don't even have to be able to pronounce it. You just need to recognize, hey, that's the name, the scientific name of a thing. And you can just call it whatever you want. If you know it's some type of plant, you can just say the plant and put that word in there. If you know it's a bacteria, you can just say the bacteria or bacteria A or whatever. Give it a name that doesn't make your tongue twist up. But you just need to be able to recognize that a scientific name is showing you the genus and species of that organism. You'll see some more of those as we go through this unit, but I wanted to show you kind of how that fits into this idea of classification as well. Any questions about that part? Okay. So we started this week by drawing some trees to illustrate the process of evolution by natural selection, which Darwin also called descent with modification. Descent as in not like physically going downwards, but like your descendants, so descending through the generations with modification, with changes. He used a tree analogy to describe this when Darwin first wrote about it, and it's still an image that you see a lot when we talk about how living things are related to each other. We still use this idea of the tree of life. Because what this illustrates is that long ago, there were only a few types of the earliest ancestors of living things. We all come from those original protocells, those really early forms of bacteria that came to be on the planet. But then over time, because they found themselves in different environmental situations and different mutations occurred, some of them branched off and became different groups of living things. They're all still connected. There are some traits, things as simple as having a cell membrane and using DNA to encode instructions. Those things are universal to all forms of life. Even the simplest types of bacteria have a cell membrane and use DNA. So those are some of the features that have been around from the base of this tree trunk all the way up through every other thing on here. But obviously other traits have appeared and spread as we move through these branches. And as we move through here, you can think of kind of the first few main divisions as like the domains of life, and then they branch into the kingdoms, and this isn't drawn that specifically to show all of those. But then eventually they get into smaller groups that might be a genus, and then you get to an individual species at the very tips of the branches. So they branch off more and more into those more and more specific groups with their unique traits. Tree type diagrams are still used very frequently to show evolutionary relationships. And obviously we don't usually draw them as an actual tree with trunks and branches and limbs, but we use diagrams that look a lot like trees to show this same idea. And that's really what we're going to be looking at today. Is something called phylogeny, which is a study of the evolutionary history of a species or a group of species, looking at how they're related to other species, what they're most similar to, what they're more distantly related to. And we represent this using things called phylogenetic trees. And so we're going to start today by making one with your pipe cleaner. So people who are at home, I just took that off so that you can see me a little more. Grab your pipe cleaners if you've got them. If not, you can just watch and visualize. People in class, grab all of your pipe cleaners. We are going to start just by building a simple tree, and then we're going to use these for a couple things. The first thing I want you to do is just twist all 5 of your pipe cleaners together at the bottom. This is the trunk of your tree. That's the very base of your tree. You can think of this as the common ancestor of all of the species on your tree. Then you're going to take 4 of your pipe cleaners. It doesn't really matter which 4, just grab 4 of them and twist those 4 together. And then out of those 4, you grab 3 and then 2, and you've probably got the pattern by now. And then once you're down to 3, grab 2 of them and twist them together. So you end with something that looks kind of like this. And as you finish, turn and look at other people's around you and see how they are similar and different. As you look at your tree, I want you to think a little bit about kind of what this represents. So a phylogenetic tree is showing the evolutionary relationships between organisms. The very tips of your pipe cleaners would represent the organisms probably that are living today or the species that you're trying to show the relationships of. There are probably other species represented down in the branches and the trunks of this tree that may or may not still be living on Earth. The colors, each color kind of traces back the evolutionary history of that specific species. On a phylogenetic tree, one of the things that we can do is trace the evolution of different traits. So at any point, if you just kind of grab onto your tree halfway up the trunk, somewhere in the middle, if a new trait evolved right where your fingers are, right now where mine are, I am holding my red, green, and purple pipe cleaners. If a new trait evolved right here, a new mutation happened to a species that existed in the tree right here, that mutation would be passed on to, assuming it was a beneficial mutation that stuck around and was selected for, that mutation would be passed on to all of the species in that section of the tree. So for mine, this mutation would be a trait that you would expect to see in the red and green and purple species. Take a look at where your fingers are and turn and tell somebody next to you which species on your tree would inherit that trait. Your answer should be all the colors of pipe cleaner that you are holding. If you just grab one pipe cleaner by itself, those species have traits, they have some mutations that make them unique and different from everything else, right? So there are some traits that only belong to that. But by tracing this back, so if you start with any particular color, I have a red pipe cleaner here, this species shares the most traits. If I trace it back, the first ones that it mixes together with are green and purple. So my red one shares the most traits with green and purple because they have something in common right here. If I go further back, the next most closely related is orange. Yellow is the least most closely related to my red. Does that make sense to everybody? Here's one other thing that's really important about these phylogenetic trees that's easier to see with pipe cleaners than anywhere else. The way that you twisted them together shows the relationships between these species. Anywhere that it branches apart, you can rotate the tree. So find somewhere in your tree, like I'm going to take this Y between my orange pipe cleaner and everything else. If I rotate that and flip it around like this, does that change anything about how these are twisted together or who's connected to who? No. And it's super important. People always look at these trees and they want to say, well, orange and yellow are the least closely related in my tree right now because they're the farthest apart. But if I go like this is actually the exact same tree, and now orange and yellow aren't furthest apart. It doesn't have to do with physical distance. It has to do with how they're connected. So as you look at these diagrams drawn on paper, which we're going to look at several today, it's important to realize that you can rotate those connecting points. Those branching points are called nodes. You can rotate your tree around any node without changing anything about how the species are actually related to each other. And it shows the exact same thing. So it doesn't really matter if you flip it backwards, forwards, turn things to the side. As long as you don't actually untwist and retwist things, you're showing the same thing. Does that idea make sense? Keep your trees handy. We're going to use those a little more later. I'm going to represent my screen so people at home can see the notes again. Take a minute now and look at the 3 trees that are up on the board. I want you to tell me if these are showing the same evolutionary relationships or different ones.
One one's just the other one turned to the side.
Yes, that is true. So one of them is just the other one turned to the side. Are any of these showing different relationships? No. And I want you to see that, as obvious as it may be, sometimes people get confused if they see a tree on its side. Occasionally, you'll even see them upside down. That's not as often, but you will frequently see them drawn sideways, or they can go up. It doesn't matter which way you turn it. It's still the same thing, right? It still is a trunk and branches. The other thing to notice, a lot of times you will see trees drawn with these lovely like right angle limbs. That's just to make it look neater and tidier on paper. It's the exact same thing as if it's drawn with straight lines. So you could, if you wanted to, bend all of your pipe cleaners to make those little right angle lines. You're still not changing the species or how they're connected and how they're related. It's the exact same thing if you have it vertically or sideways or upside down. Doesn't matter. So a couple of features to point out here. A phylogenetic tree is always rooted. It always has all of the lines connected at the base. The trunk of the tree represents the common ancestor of all the species that are shown within that tree. And obviously, a tree like this is only showing 5 species. We're not showing every single thing on the planet. But that would represent the common ancestor of all of these species. It shares characteristics with every single color pipe cleaner in your tree. The branch points, as I already mentioned, are called nodes. Those represent a place where one group of that species, so at each node, there was some common ancestor that existed right there. There was some organism that was the ancestor of everything above it on your tree, or to the right of it on your tree, depending how it's drawn. And a mutation happened in some of those individuals. Maybe they ended up on a separate island. Maybe they found themselves stranded by a storm somewhere, something. For some reason, they were in a slightly different environment. That mutation became beneficial, and they kind of branched off and became a new species or a new group of species. And we'll talk more later about how that process of forming new species happens. But every node represents a place where 2 groups diverged. They separated in terms of their evolutionary history and became new groups of organisms. The other thing is if we have 2 groups or 2 taxa means a taxonomic group, so a classification group, that are closely related, we refer to them as sister taxa. So in this tree, C and D are the ones that are labeled. A and B would also be considered sister taxa. Look at your tree and figure out which 2 colors would represent sister taxa on your tree. Did you find them? You should have 2 at the top that are most closely. For mine, it would be green and purple. Okay, we're going to practice a little bit with these. I just have a few questions where you are going to be looking at some trees and interpreting them to see if you understand the basic idea. We're going to continue working with these in different forms for a while. But on this one, which lived more recently in time, the common ancestor of A and B or the common ancestor of B and C? Turn and talk to somebody about that. If you're at home, you can just jot down the answer, think about it to make sure that you're understanding these correctly. Go. So which ones share a more recent common ancestor? B and C. Remember, time, if you think of it, time on a tree like this goes from the root up towards the top. So time kind of goes in this direction, which means this divergence happened first. This one happened second. And it's not a precise measurement. The length doesn't necessarily mean sooner or later. It's not an absolute. But when they come one after the other like that, you know this one had to be more recent. The connection between B and C is more recent. To get back to the common ancestor of A and B, you have to go all the way back to here, which is further back in evolutionary time. All right. We're going to kind of skip this one. The red node we were just talking about, that's the common ancestor of B and C, right? That's the point where those two species kind of diverged. So we just talked about that one, so we don't need that one. Take a look at this one. There's more than one correct way to show relationships. 3 of the 4 trees below show the exact same relationship between A, B, and C. Which one shows a different relationship? Look at these carefully. See if you can find the one that's actually different. You can turn and tell somebody next to you once we got it. Which one's actually different? Number 2. The easiest way is to look at the sister taxa, the ones that are most closely related. Here, C and B are most closely related, but here, A and C are most closely related, so that's actually a different arrangement. These two also have B and C. So this is the one that is different. Again, it doesn't matter if you turn the tree on its side. If you rotate and kind of swap the position, those are all the same tree. But if you actually rearrange species, then it's showing different evolutionary relationships. One more, same thing. Which of these trees is different than the others? Find it? Which one's actually showing a different relationship? Number 4. Yep, because in the other 3, B and C are sister taxa and D and E are sister taxa. But in the last one, they're rearranged. So C and D and E and B. So looking at those closest groupings is the easiest way to tell. But it's important to realize that 1, 2, and 3 are all showing the exact same information. So now we're going to actually try building some phylogenetic trees based on characteristics that we can observe about a species. So here, we're going to start with this example, and then you're going to be doing this with some other organisms that I'll give you in a minute. But if you just look at these beetles, take 1 minute, turn and tell somebody next to you like 3 or 4 differences that you notice between those. Before scientists were able to actually go in and sequence DNA, which is how they do a lot of this phylogenetic work now, most of the classification of organisms was just based on traits that we could see. So that's how we're going to practice this today. We'll get to kind of how genetics plays into it later. But here you can see obvious differences in color, in shape, in pattern, in heads and antenna and all that kind of stuff. So the first thing we do is we just identify different features and kind of record what we see. And you're going to be doing this process in a minute. This one's mostly done, but I'm just going to show you how we use this to build a tree. Here we've identified 7 different ways that they're different: shape, color, head color, antenna, jaws, spots on the back, and the color of the spots. And then for each one, we just describe that characteristic. Are they oval or round shaped? Are they yellow or orange or pink? Do they have a white or black head, etc.? So that's just organizing your observations, okay? Then to try and start figuring out the relationships between these, one way you can approach this, and this isn't the only way to build a phylogenetic tree, but this is the method that we're going to practice today, is to compare pairs of species and count the differences. So like if we compare letter A and B and just go across the row, they're both oval, They're both yellow. They have a different head color, so that's one difference. No antenna, yes jaws, yes spots, and they're both black. So there's just one difference between those two. Then we would compare species A and C and count how many differences there. That's the data that you see in this chart down at the bottom, okay? So species A and B have one difference between them. Species A and C, if we went through and counted, they have 1, 2, 3 differences, but these 4 things are all the same. So do you understand what data this is showing? They just counted all the differences. Once we know how many differences there are between all the pairs of species, then we can actually use that to start trying to build a tree. So that's what we're going to do here. I have actually taken all these little bugs and put them on pipe cleaner so that I can physically build this tree as well, just so that you can see it. And people at home, I'll take the presentation down in a minute so you can see that better. But the way that we start, you can also just draw this out on paper. The way that you start is you look at this data and find the ones that are most closely related. So we're going to start with the species that only have one difference. So that tells me species A and B only have one thing different. So they are very closely related. So I'm going to find my A and B. And I'm going to attach those two together up near the top because they're probably pretty closely related. Okay? A and B are very closely related. You can also just draw this out, but I want to actually have the pipe cleaners to show it a little bit later. The other ones that only have one difference are C and F. So if I take those, I'll do the same thing. I have to use 2 orange pipe cleaners because I only have 5 colors and I have 6 bugs. It's okay. So C and F are also very closely related. So we're going to connect C and F. And I didn't have to write them quite that close, but that's okay. So now we've taken care of that and this. Then we go to our next closest. So here are 2's. C is pretty closely related to B. And so since I have C over here and B over here, I would guess maybe there's a connection there. Does that make sense? And you have to kind of try this out. And I am kind of working through this as I do it, so I might be wrong. We'll just see. So I'm going to take those and I'm going to twist those together, see what kind of tree I end up with here. And you do have to kind of double check this at the end and see if it all makes sense and if it works and if they share characteristics all the way. The other one that was pretty closely related here, so I just added this one, D and E are also fairly closely related, and we haven't used either of those yet. So we're going to put D and E over here and say that those two only have a couple differences, so they're probably pretty closely related to each other as well. Then you look at number 3, and some of these we've probably already done. So we did this one. So this one, C and A, we've already got C and A connected here. So we kind of took care of that. They're pretty closely related. This one, B and F, so we've also got those. So it makes sense. We're still kind of within this grouping. 4 is A and F, so we're still there. Those are already connected. And then when we get to about 5 differences, then we get to A and D. So I'm going to guess that those are connected way back there. So then the nice thing about doing this with pipe cleaners is then you can actually look at the pictures and see if this tree kind of makes sense. So I'm going to stop sharing this for a minute so that people at home see me. So now you can see I have actually built this. And by looking at it, you can see why these are similar and different from each other. You can see the 2 that are close to each other are usually the same color. So I have 2 orange bugs, 2 yellow bugs, 2 red bugs. So that obviously makes sense. Then I can also look and say, okay, are these 4 different from these 2? Let me see, what's that difference? Spots and no spots. All of the ones that I have up on this branch have the spots on them. These 2 don't. So then you can kind of figure out where those different traits evolved. and make sure that the tree makes sense that you built. Do you have any questions about kind of how this process works? Because now you are going to get a chance to try it on your own. And you can draw out the tree like we did up on the board, or you can build it with your pipe cleaners and actually put the little pictures at the top if that's helpful to you. I think it's a nice way to kind of check and see if it makes sense. But I want you to practice going through this process and kind of using your observations to build a tree of your own, okay? Those of you who are at home, I have this on a Jamboard, and so I'm going to put a link to that into the chat here. And since there's only 3 of you, I'm not going to put you in a breakout room or anything. I will just mute out, and you can all talk to each other and pull up the Jamboard and kind of work through it. It has charts for you to make your observations and collect the data. And then you can just draw your tree on there and kind of slide the pictures around to build it that way. If you want to do it with pipe cleaners, if you find that helpful, you're welcome to do that as well, but you don't have to. Those of you in class have a handout that kind of shows you or gives you a place to collect your data. So give me 1 second to give you some organisms to look at, and then we will get started on that. All right, so Kylie and Emma and Ashley, there's a link to a Jamboard in the chat. You can open that up. It has pictures of the organisms on the front, so you can start making some observations. And you can either write the data on the next screen, or if it's easier just to make the chart in your notes to record your observations and stuff, you're welcome to do that as well, okay? And I'll come check in with you in a couple minutes and see if you have any questions. For now, I am going to mute and then hand things out to you folks. So people in class, you can also do this with a partner. Or you can do it on your own. I have plenty of little pictures for you to use. Oh, hang on, I gotta mute them too.
Hi.
Hi.
Should one of us just share it?
Okay. I just forgot to mute that part for them. All right. What did I give you? Flowers.
Wait, are they just flowers? Is that what they label them? Like the organism name?
The names are like A, B, C, D, E, F.
But yeah, I know, but like wait, just flowers.
Those are traits. You need to come up with the 7 different traits. And I have another set. Do you want to do this on your own?
Yeah, that's what I was, yeah, I think she.
I just didn't have time to cut them all out, but I have them. So, you get some birdies. So the first thing you need to do is identify 7 ways that your organisms are different. That's what you put across the top of that first chart.
They all have like petal shape. Oh, like all of them have petal?
Yeah.
How do you spell petal?
P-E-T-A-L.